All right, I think we're good. You can see my screen real quick. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
March webinar. Okay, cool. Just wanted to double check. All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the NWA, the National Weather Association's webinar. My name is Becca Mazer, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. A few logistics before we get started. Everyone, all of you wonderful attendees will be kept on mute for the entirety of the talk. But you can ask questions either through the webinar GUI, the questions feature here, or you can go on Twitter and ask your questions on Twitter using the hashtag NWA webinar. You can also follow along the NWA account at NWAS and ask your questions there. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded for later viewing. So I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today. We're going to be talking all about fire weather, which we're leading up into the fire weather season here shortly. So I'd like to introduce my speakers here. We have Mark Strathwolf. He is a meteorologist with the National Weather Service in Salt Lake City, Utah. We have Tamara Wall, who is the Deputy Director of the Western Region Climate Center, and Sarah Jacober, who is a master's student at the University of Nevada in Reno and also works with the Western Regional Climate Center. So what I'd like to do here is give our speakers a little bit of an opportunity to go ahead and introduce themselves further and talk a little bit about what they do and their research and their operations, all about fire weather. So Mark, we'll let you start.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Strathwolf. I'm from the Salt Lake City Forecast Office, and I've been with the Weather Service for 30-some years now. And I took over the fire weather program back in 2007, and it was the best decision in my life. It was great, other than marrying my wife, but it was a great decision. I got 30-some missions under my belt, and this past November, December, I had the opportunity to go to Australia. So that was an awesome experience, and I'll be telling you more about that experience further on in this broadcast. I do like the opportunity of being an incident meteorologist because you're right there with the customer. So if you have negative feedback or positive feedback, you're right there working with the customer. And so you really get to know how the customer, how my forecast is actually being used with the customer. And so that's a great opportunity.
All right, so hi, I'm Tamara Wall, and this is Sarah Jacober right behind me, or next to me, 6 feet apart. I'd like to point that out. It's really 6 feet apart. So I'm the Deputy Director of the Western Regional Climate Center. And unlike my fellow compatriots here, I am not a meteorologist, a climatologist, an atmospheric scientist. I am actually a social scientist, and I've done most of my work looking at fire and kind of human interactions, often working with fire management agencies. And that's kind of how this project started. Is several years ago, we got some funding from 2 NOAA programs, NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Information System, and then also the RISA program, which is funded in NOAA it's the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program. Through our California Nevada RISA team, CNAP, which is the California Nevada Applications Program, to start looking at the red flag warning and watches program. That came about for several different reasons, but mostly because there's always, there's the current ongoing effort, hazard simplification within the National Weather Service. But there's also a sense that perhaps the uses and how the red flag warning and watches program was being used had maybe shifted over time. There were questions about who the program was really meant to inform. And then we were also starting to see, proliferation is too strong of a word, But we were starting to see additional categorization within the red flag warning and watches program, i.e. particularly dangerous situation, red flags. There was kind of the novel social media spontaneous purple flag that came out of the California fires in, gosh, was that 2017 or 18? 18, I think. Yeah, I think it was the fall fires in California and Southern California in 2018. And so we started taking a look at it. And then recently, the C-STAR program provided some additional funding to hire a graduate student, in this case, Sarah, to actually work on some of the more technical aspects of, what would a revamped set of criteria for red flag watches and warnings look like. And Sarah, do you want to talk briefly about your background?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Jacober. This is the end of my first year here in Reno at DRI. And my professional background, other than schooling, is I've actually spent 10 years with the Forest Service in an operational fire capacity. So I have a little bit of fluency with the terminology and the general idea. Academically, my undergraduate is actually in engineering, so I'm not an atmospheric scientist either quite yet. So.
We're kind of a big tent group. We like lots of different expertises in our group. So.
All right, we actually have a special guest as well, Ben Bartos. He is not able to get his webcam up and going, but he's on the phone, and he is a meteorologist with the National Weather Service up here in Anchorage. Ben, are you able to speak? Or can you go ahead?
Hey, Becca. Yeah, I got you. Sorry.
There you go.
Thanks for the special guest introduction there. My apologies for not having a webcam access at the moment. But yeah, no, I'm a meteorologist at the Anchorage Forecast Office and the National Weather Service. I spent 5 years in the Fairbanks Weather Office and moved down to Anchorage here in the past year and a half. Like Mark, I'm also in the IMET program, newer into the program. Definitely the best decision I've made as far as programs to join in the Weather Service. To date, it's been an excellent program here. And yeah, I'm also the fire weather focal point in the forecast office here, both was in Fairbanks and in Anchorage. And yeah, I'd really enjoy getting out on Alaska fires when possible.
I guess I was on mute. Let me start over that. So thank you, Ben, for your for joining us, and we'll go ahead now and do a question, just a general question and answers roundtable discussion, because that's always fun. So we'll start with you, Mark. Everybody I know is just really interested in hearing more about your experience in Australia. What it's like to work over there, south of the equator where everything's backwards, and how is it, especially with the fire weather program there at the Bureau of Meteorology. So can you just go ahead and start, sharing your story of what it's like, what it was like to work down there?
Sure. As you mentioned, things are not backwards per se, they're opposite. So high pressure systems rotate counterclockwise and lows go clockwise. And basically think of looking at a forecast through a mirror because everything is the opposite direction. So that was one of the challenges. Also, the wind barbs, when you're looking at the winds, instead of having the wind barbs on the right side or the left side, they're on the right side. So that kind of made it a little bit more complex as well. So that was two of the challenges. And the challenge that was probably the toughest was converting their Z time to local time, because they're 18 hours different than we are here in Salt Lake City. So say a Tuesday morning of 23Z was actually Monday morning, or vice versa. I forget what it was. It only took me 6 weeks to get used to, and that's when it was time for me to go home. But it was definitely a challenge. And where the fires were this year was quite different than past years. Down in Australia, we have main part of the continent is all desert in the middle, and majority of the population is along the coastline. And on the East Coast, there's about a 50 to 70 kilometer band of very dense forest, subtropical in some cases. And the fires this year were right on the edge of this mountain divide, what they call the Great Divide. And it stretches from northern part of Australia all the way down to the southern edge, and everything to the east of that mountain divide basically was quite forested. And that's where all the resources that they were trying to protect, because that's where the people live. And the challenge there was that every day we would get a marine push, and how far that marine push would go in towards that Great Divide and how deep it was quite critical in the forecast that we made for those fires. And as mentioned, numerous fires. At the time I was there, we had anywhere from 100 to 120, 130 fires going on at once, and they were only able to have us provide about 30, sometimes 40 spot forecasts. And spot forecasts are tailored forecasts for a specific fire. They call it a fire ground, which I kind of like the idea of calling it a fire ground. But the problem there was that we had to prioritize. And when you prioritize, it seems like there might be some fires that are being skipped. And so that made it sometimes thinking that, can't we do more for these firefighters out there? And so I tended to have this feeling that, can't we keep on giving forecasts throughout the day and the night? And the problem was that they basically had to wait in the morning until their grids that the Bureau of Meteorology was creating, have them finalized by about 11 o'clock in the morning, and then we could start creating the forecast for the spots. And to me, I think that was a little bit less advantageous to the firefighters, because we could have been providing forecast from the previous night's forecast that was already in place. And so I didn't think we really had to wait until the very end of the new data to provide a forecast. So I think that was a drawback that didn't really sit well with me, and I know the other forecasters thought the same thing that went down from the United States. We did have a heavy workload, and they were very, very appreciative of us being there to help pull that workload. So basically from about 11 o'clock in the morning when we first started making the forecast, after they prioritized the top 20 or 30, then we got moving and got those forecasts out. And basically we finished around 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Even though there was some more coming in, they didn't want to set a precedence of doing more than they thought they were capable of doing. And so not all the fires got spot forecasts. They had to look at the general forecast. One other issue that I felt that if we could have gotten some feedback from the actual firefighters, that was one thing that was lacking. So here in the United States, when you're working right with a team, you're right there at the fire. So you know whether you've nailed the forecast or the forecast went awry. There, we never really got the feedback that would be helpful in future forecasts. So that was a drawback that I think was probably the largest drawback that I felt, that we didn't have that connection that we have here. We're right there in the camp with the operations, the incident command team, the fire behavior analysts. And so when you're working all together in close proximity, you have a much tighter conversation and unit there. And here you're working remotely. So I was working from Sydney, while the fire behavior analysts were working about 30 miles away in this big command center. And then the firefighters, of course, were out in the field. And so there was this definite disconnect that was going on there. But overall, what a great experience. Learned a lot. And I just want to say that those folks of Australia, the meteorologists I worked with, were professional from top to bottom, and it was a real pleasure to be there.
That's excellent. We'll kind of stick with the IMET theme here real quick. Hey, Ben, working up here in Alaska, I think you were able to get out on a couple fires up here. What was that like working up here in Alaska? And tell us a little bit about the fire season that we just had.
Sure, yeah. Alaska is a pretty unique environment for not only what we protect when you're fighting a fire, but also the actual rating system that we use for actually helping to fight fires. And when I say that, I mean we use like the Canadian model of establishing your fire, like fuel moisture and those kinds of things with a fire. So in the lower 48, a lot of times I've just used like the fire rating danger system that most people are used to, but there's actually a Canadian model as well, and that actually is much more applicable to Alaska because of the boreal forest we have here. So the Canadian model's more geared towards working with like all the pine boreal forest that you have that covers a lot of Canada, and that actually extends, if you were to see that on a map, into Alaska. So especially the interior of Alaska. So that model actually works much better for us. So going out on fires in Alaska this summer, it's really cool to see that in process, where you're looking more at like things like the forest duff and like what would be called a duff moisture code for how dry the organic materials, not at the leaf litter level, like the very top tier of ground level, but the stuff below it, like your peat moss and those kinds of things, like how dry those are and how that fuels fire spread. And yeah, this summer was quite dry and unprecedented in a few ways. I remember being out on the Swan Lake fire down on the Kenai Peninsula, and we were moving into uncharted territory. It was so dry of fuel-wise, what was burnable and what was not. So that was an interesting process to be a part of, really working with the F-bands there, which was really their more wheelhouse than mine. So being able to contribute the weather piece to that and seeing how they were working through that situation to figure out, where fire spread was going to go and stuff like that was very interesting.
So quick question, since some of our audience may not know who the F-ban is, what does that acronym mean, and who exactly is the F-ban and what do they do?
Oh, thanks. Yes. So an F-ban is what's called a fire behavior analyst, and that is who, when you're out on a fire as an incident meteorologist, you will work hand in hand with them, and actually technically you would work for them in the group that you work in. When you're on a fire, they're all split up into different parts of an organization there to get the mission accomplished. But anyway, yeah, the F-ban, or a fire behavioral analyst, there's three different prongs, or we'll call it a triangle in fire weather, that fire is dependent on. There's fuels, topography, and weather. So I do the weather piece because it's a very complex piece, and then you have a fire behavior analyst who also knows weather very well, I should say. And they're going to look at things like how much fuel is available to burn, what is the moisture content of that fuel. Like there's all different, basically, like fuel classifications that they'll look through depending on like how big the trees are, what kind of brush there is under the trees, what kind of burnable fuels are on the ground, and they'll just go from like the surface all the way to like the canopy and see what's available to burn, and then they'll incorporate the weather into that, like how strong is the wind blowing, what's the relative humidity, what's the temperature, to see what will burn and what will not, how fast, will the fire spread, or like a rate of spread, those kinds of things. And so they'll look at the fuels and the topography and put together a forecast for how this fire is going to burn, what they expect, and then the weather person like myself or Mark will actually input our weather into that and work really side by side with them. We're really conjoined at the hip on a fire with figuring out actually like what is that fire going to do. So
Yeah, it sounds like a extremely collaborative process. And Mark, I can imagine that having to work remotely and not be right there in the fire camp itself must have been tough because, I mean, were you able to, so you weren't able to communicate at all with folks on on the fires overnight, say, because I know at our camps here in the US, you know, you have radios and stuff, you can communicate with folks if weather's changing critically or you know, basically to get them out of danger. So how did that work there in Australia? Were you able to, you know, communicate any sort of danger if conditions change quickly during
Yeah,
your off hours, that is?
yeah, Becca, we did have the opportunity, and I just want to stress that the reason a meteorologist is at a fire is for the safety of the firefighters and also for the tactical and strategic planning of the incident management team. So being disconnected from the firefighters themselves and not getting feedback was often questionable. Is our forecast actually helping, or is it not hitting the nail on the head? So a few times I did get a phone call from the field, actually not from the field, from the fire behavior analyst who was not in the field. He was at the EOC, Emergency Operations Center. And so it seemed like there's different levels of communication. And so by the time we got on the phone with the fire behavior analyst, he already talked earlier. And so sometimes there was this not a good connection right to the field. So we had to kind of play telephone where I gave the latest information that what I could see on satellite, radar, and then move that information along via telephone to the fire behavior analyst that was at the EOC, and then they would take the information and pass along. So it wasn't the most efficient, but there was at least a way of getting the information out to the field. I have to say though that that didn't happen too often, that we actually talked to someone from the fire behavior or a fire behavior analyst. It happened a few times, and I think if we could cut down the amount of time going through this phone tree, we could have been maybe a little bit more beneficial to the firefighters on the ground.
I'm sure that they, excuse me, we're very grateful to have you all there to, you know, do the best you can to keep the firefighters safe and maybe learn a few tricks of the trade, I guess, so to speak, because it was such a bad season down there. Do you want to quickly talk about that, how bad it was down there before we move on to a different topic
Yeah,
with your slides?
here's a slide that Becca's going to show for us.
Yeah.
That's just amazing, the amount of area that was burned this year. And this is only up through the January 14th. The fire season was still going on into early February, but you can see that going way back even into the early 70s, where there's 3.5 million hectares burned, that was overcome in no time at all by the time we got into late December this past year. And it was just an incredible fire season. And unfortunately, the years that we see on the graph, a lot of that fire was out in rangeland. This year was in the forest, and it was right up, butting up against urban areas. And I want to just point out this particular chart here is that there's what we call heritage sites, agricultural or natural sites. There's diversity of trees, there are animals in these areas that they want to protect. And unfortunately, we can see down here under New South Wales, NSW, in the Blue Mountains, 80% of that World Heritage area, that they were just finding some trees that they've never found anywhere else in the world. There's a 25 acre area that had this tree that they never found anywhere else, and they believe it's gone. And so it's really sad when you come to think of the diversity of these forests, and that there may be some aspects of trees or animals that they yet to find, and they may be extinct now after this horrendous fire season.
Yeah, it's not just the human toll that is taken from these fires, but sometimes, you know, remarkable natural life out there in nature. You know, it's susceptible to the fires as well. I mean, but fires are good too for the nature, for the forest, I should say. So it's really give and take. So we talked a little bit about, you know, danger, fire danger rating systems and whatnot. So I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk with Tamara and Sarah about their work with the Severe Fire Danger Index. Do you want to sort of go a little bit into your research on that and explain what it is and how it perhaps could be used in the future?
Let you talk about it, Sarah.
Yeah, sure. So the Severe Fire Danger Index is a index proposed by Matt Jolly out of Missoula last year. And what it does is it essentially takes the ERC and BI, which are indices derived from NFDRS, which is the model that basically takes fuels and weather and combines them to quantify fire danger. And a lot of the work with these ERC and BI values is done in percentile due to normalizing for fuel models across the country. So Matt Jolly essentially looked at the 90, he quantified the percentiles and ranked them on severity and classified the most severe, which is what we looked at, as conditions where ERC and BI values were over the 97th percentile. So historically extreme. We originally started looking at this from an operational safety standpoint.
Do you want to explain BI and ERC real quick?
Yeah, sure. ERC is energy component, which is essentially a measure of how much fuel is available in front of the fire. And BI is burning index, roughly proportional to flame length. So fire danger, and they all have weather components and fuel components in the indices themselves. So the graphic that's on the screen now is, we're skipping all the way ahead to basically the conclusions, which is just fine. We were looking into using SFDI in the red flag model somehow to incorporate a standardized fuels component. And unfortunately, what we found was that SFDI is an amazing objective forecast, meaning that it is going to forecast the fuels conditions, because it's a percentile based on the fuels conditions for the period of record. So what we're kind of noticing, and this is relatively new preliminary findings, is that if we were to incorporate it in a red flag warning, it's not necessarily as, the frequency of it is not distributed evenly at all. There's super high frequency years, which is shown in the graph, where you're going to have 80 plus days of a severe. So you're essentially breaking your percentiles are resetting themselves as they go in these very, very dry seasons. And so it's more of a seasonal, to me at least so far in my interpretation, it's far more of a seasonal metric and less of an annual day-to-day fluctuation. So for a red flag forecast, there is potential to look at it in some way, and we'll explore that more in the future, but it would be incredibly objective. And I don't know if it would necessarily meet the needs of the public, because the public is thinking fire season conditions, and the SFDI is broadcasting historical fuel conditions. So that's kind of what we've looked at, and we've done some more work. This is just frequency data. We've looked at some candidates for potentially dangerous situations, and those all come up as severe in SFDI. And we've also looked at entrapment and fatality data. And that honestly is not as strong a relationship as you'd think. It's pretty correlative, but there's a lot of other factors in the operational safety realm. And so that's not necessarily as cut and dry. I think our next step on the quantitative side of the project is we're going to start to gather some operating plans and look at maybe doing some forecast verification and contrasting that with the SFDI and some other metrics that we're still kind of brainstorming and seeing exactly how accurate the red flags are.
So do you calculate the SFDI prior to the season, or is this post-season that you calculate it, or is it throughout the season?
These calculations are after the season. This data actually was provided to me by Matt Jolly, but the NFDRS is calculated up to 3 days in advance, and so it would be forecastable.
Excellent. And so from we'll talk about the social science perspective of forecasting. You know, what do you see as the biggest misconception that the public or forecasters may have on fire weather forecasts and the red flag watches and warnings? You know, essentially, what do you see as potential change for the future to really hit home the point that, especially for our public, today is an extremely dangerous day in terms of fire weather conditions. What should you, the public, do to be safe? So, and not spread fires or not start fires. Yeah, what do you think is the biggest wave of going towards the future in terms of social science perspective?
Well, you know, when we started this project, we actually, one of the things we did is one of my graduate research assistants did the heroic work of scooping up every AOP from every National Weather Service office, or I think he managed to get all of them, their current annual operating plans. He was really a trooper. He got all of those, and he's persistent. He got everything he could get his hands on.
That's quite a task.
It's quite a task. We have that database if anybody wants it. We're happy to share it. But what he went through is then we went in and we qualitatively coded all of the red flag criteria that were being used. And we took a very, very nuanced look at it. So even if it was 1 degree of wind speed different, we coded that differently, right? We gave that its own code. And, you know, it's a little bit of a, you know, it's like the number of M&Ms in the jar, but, you know, how many red flag, you know, unique red flag criteria, you know, were there? And the answer was, I think it was about 524 unique criteria. So, I mean, a lot of them were very similar. I mean, there was a lot of overlap, but, you know, in the strictest sense, there was a lot of, there are many criteria being used.
And quick question.
Go ahead.
Who sets those criteria? Is it the Weather Service, or is it the Forest Service, or is it a collaborative effort?
Each individual whether a WFO, right? So, and how those criteria are set are often widely divergent across, you know, the WFOs. Some are rather historical in nature, and they've kind of been cumulative over decades about, you know, what is the criteria for issuing a red flag warning or watch. Other offices have more recently done a statistical analysis, you know, and pulled, you know, their top percentile, you know, values, for example, you know, and set breakpoints that way for their individual region. You know, in the West, we have what they call fire zones, which are used much more predominantly in the Western United States than they are in other parts of the United States. And so it really is all over the map on that sense. But I guess 2 key things that we noticed that were, you know, kind of driving the development of this project is, one, is there some past research that I had done when I was looking at, I think it was pocket cards, fire danger pocket cards. It kind of indicated that for many wildland firefighters, because particularly like in areas of, for example, the Great Basin, you know, areas that are typically fairly arid and often very windy, they would often see red flag warnings continuously day after day. And so there is a sense that previously, perhaps red flag warnings have been overused, you know, or initiated. So that was a concern. Some of the preliminary research I did for this, I think that that's been pushed back on in some ways, and they're not issued as frequently in some areas as they once were. The other real question that's kind of come up is, who are the red flag watches and warnings for? Are they to inform, fire management, or are they to inform other sophisticated user groups like the sheriff's department or emergency management, or are they for the general public? And so that's kind of where the social science part of this project will be working, where the National Weather Service has, done some, requested, funded some research to look at the public's perception of red flags, warning, and watches. So I think that's where this is going, is really trying to figure out who is the main target audience for these. Is there a secondary audience? Is the current number of tiers accurate, is meeting everybody's needs? Which I said before, when you have additional products, kind of arising, or categorizations kind of rising, that's usually an indicator that the existing product isn't meeting all of the needs. And then, the big bugaboo, which is what Sarah is trying to work on, is the fuels component, because the National Weather Service does not do fuels. So unlike...
Can you explain that a little bit more, what the fuels component is for the folks in our audience who may not know?
Right, so
Just
you
real
could
quickly.
have really, really low humidity. You could have an incredibly windy day. It could be really hot. But if the fuels aren't dry, and this is really Sarah's expertise rather than mine, so you should jump in if I get it wrong.
You're getting it right so far.
Good. So, if the fuels aren't ready to burn, you're not going to have fire. You're not going to have dangerous fires. Dangerous fires are typically characterized by difficult to control, explosive growth, rapid spread, right? Those are the fires that are particularly problematic, particularly when they are in, areas where there are power lines, communities live. Those are the things that really make fire managers and emergency managers, wake up in a cold sweat at night when they think about them. So, so if you don't have the fuels component, then it's just not, there's no worry. But if your criteria are all based on RH and wind, you may be issuing red flags without meeting that criteria, but there really is no particular fire danger. So, but it is a challenge, because the National Weather Service does weather, not fuels. So how do you accommodate that fuels component, accurately, in deciding that the criteria have been met, and how each WFO meets that challenge is often very, very unique and individualistic. So there's a lack of kind of consistency perhaps across the landscape.
And so this will be a question for everybody. How do you think we as researchers and forecasters can better communicate the threat of potential fire spread, I guess you can say, to the general public? And just thinking off the top of your head. And I want to bring in the broadcaster, the broadcast meteorologist, and can we loop them into this conversation to better communicate the threat to their viewers as well, using plain language and whatnot? Do you foresee this, maybe for the Weather Service folks, have you ever teamed up with your broadcasters in the area to sort of go over that? And then Tamara and Sarah, is that something that perhaps you would envision in the future, to sit down with even with broadcasters too and get their input? I'm just curious.
So I'll start. So previously I worked on a project called the Santa Ana Winds Threat Index. And so this is a product that was originally based on Tom Rolinski's offshore wind product in Southern California. And after the 2007 fires in San Diego County, it was basically San Diego Gas and Electric, Predictive Services, the local fire agencies, San Diego Fire, LA Fire, all kind of came together and began working on what we call SOT-T to develop this product, and one of its intentions was to actually make the message about fire danger and fire risk to the public more consistent. And we just recently finished evaluating SAWT. We should have the report out in about a month, because SAWT's now been used for, I think, about 6 or 7 years, and kind of looking at its impact and what it's done. We tried to reach out to the broadcast community to interview them, and unfortunately, met with no success on that. So we don't have that perspective in there. But overall, I think the general idea is that SAWT was successful. And so I think there are projects out there that have done that in the past that we can look to. But it's always making that message consistent is always a real challenge.
Indeed. Mark and Ben, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll interject here. We work at the National Weather Service here in Salt Lake very closely with the predictive services out of the Geographic Area Coordination Center. And so we get a really good idea of what the fuels are. So we've been in contact with them over the last probably 7 to 10 years, working closely with them so that we don't put a red flag warning out when the fuels are not ready. So in that regard, I think we've made some good strides into that decision point. As far as the media taking it, it seems like over the last 5 to 10 years, the media has really picked up on broadcasting where we have red flag warnings. To my knowledge, though, I have not sat down with any one of the local broadcasters to really get into the weeds as far as what the red flag warning means. They put it up there so the general public knows where the zones are or the areas of our state that has red flag warning, but I don't think they've done, or we probably have not done a great job as communicating with the public really what that means to them. And maybe that's where we need to emphasize some more outreach.
Well, I think it's really challenging. If you look at, warnings, the red flag warning and watches doesn't always line up with the other, hazards, right? Warnings and watches, and it's not as easy as a winter storm, or it's really hard, because if there's no fire occurs, is that a winter, what does that mean for forecast verification, right? There's the general on, that is not always in alignment with what we think of as forecast verification. So it is a really, really tough, product, I think.
I know in my experiences, it's been one of the tougher weather programs or elements to forecast and accurately alert for, essentially. I mean, you could have a fire ongoing, you don't know it, and then winds may not even reach your criteria, so to speak, and the fire will spread. And so, is that a miss, so to speak? Or if you don't have an alert out, it's just so challenging. I definitely agree with that. Just wanted to throw out to our audience that please send in your questions via the questions GUI or Twitter using the hashtag NWA webinar. We're going to go on for a few more minutes, so please give us your questions. I want to sort of, go back to maybe a little bit of the IMET camps and or just in general, like even some of your experiences out there, Sarah. What have been your favorite experiences, your favorite stories that you would like to share from your experiences out in the field?
I'll start first. So back in 2015, I got assigned to a fire up in Washington State. And as I indicated earlier, going to a camp can be very stressful. Initially, when you first get there, everyone's ramping up. The fire is spreading rapidly. Typically, there are resources at stake. And so the first several days of fire camp can be very stressful. But then as the fire starts getting under control by the firefighters or the weather changes, then the atmosphere of the camp itself kind of relaxes. And I bring this particular one up because after like the first 3 days of very hectic fire weather going on, trying to get the forecast perfect and the stresses involved, we got into a period where a high pressure system came in, and each day it got warmer and warmer, and my forecast sounded very redundant: hot and dry, hot and dry, hotter and drier. And so about the 4th day of going from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s and 90s, in the morning briefing, when there's like 300, 400 people out there, they would play on the loudspeaker system about 5 minutes prior to the briefing starting. They would play some music just to get everyone knowing that there is going to be the briefing starting. And so everyone's gathered around, they turn the music off, the operations person gets up there and does his spiel, and then I get up there and I start giving the forecast. I'm probably 5 seconds into my forecast, and across the intercom system comes this blurting, really loud music of hot, 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 this Latino type music, hot, hot, hot. And I'm like a deer in headlights, like, what's going on here? Interrupting my briefing. And I turn to my side, and there's the incident commander just like basically rolling on the ground, pointing the finger at me, like, I got you. You're just, every day you're saying hot, hot, hot. So now he puts it on the intercom system. So it caught me off guard, but it was something I always remember, that, you know what, everyone can lighten up during the middle of these fires when everything's under control, and it's a really friendly atmosphere there. So that was one of my favorite experiences out there on the fire ground.
Anyone else have any stories they want to share?
Ben has been off.
I'd say for me, oh, go ahead. Sorry, did I just start over talking to somebody there?
She was just saying,
Ben
go ahead,
has been
Tamara. Yeah. Go ahead, Ben.
All right. No, yeah, I'd say the first fire I went on was actually over 4th of July, and that was really cool to actually see the community that we had our ICP in actually came out. I remember there was a young girl, maybe like 10 or so, just did an absolutely beautiful rendition of the national anthem, and she wanted to come out and do that to show her support. Nobody asked her to do that at all. Little things like that are really cool, especially over like 4th of July and stuff like that. It's definitely like an added layer there of kind of like that service part that we all join the weather service for, to be able to go out and do that on a holiday such as that one's really cool. That's a good memory of mine for sure.
Awesome. All right, so here's another question from the audience. And, this is not quite up my wheelhouse. I'm not super familiar with the marine community using the red flags for alerting for rip currents. But is there a concern, or has there been a lot of miscommunication perhaps in using the red flag warning for the fire potential hazards in particular in the Great Lakes states, and then using the red flag warnings for rip currents as well?
I don't have any, I have not heard of that before. So I do know when we were kind of scanning people for how they used red flags, often there were non-fire applications of those that were based on wind. For example, crane operators in big urban areas will look at, we'll keep an eye on those because it usually indicates that they'll have to stop using their cranes. In Reno, our air quality board here will use red flag warnings to issue dust abatement orders, right? So those are, to protect our particulate counts, try and keep those down. And so they'll order like construction sites to go out and do dust abatement if a red flag is issued. So I'm more familiar around those, usually there's a wind based, and I would guess that rip currents might be part of that, but I do not know that anybody who's looked at that significantly.
Okay. Here's another question from our audience. So how do we communicate a potential threat for at-risk communities such as Paradise, where weather conditions can create extreme rates of spread? No fire, no threat, but if a new fire starts, there are only minutes before it burns homes. I guess a Reno Coughlin fire also comes to mind. Do you have any thoughts on that?
What was the first part of that again, Becca?
How do we communicate how do we communicate a potential threat for at-risk communities such as Paradise?
So this is something we've really struggled with. So when we were designing SATI, I was a big advocate for 3 tiers, 3 categorizations, no threat, pay attention, really pay attention. It's kind of how I, loosely characterize them, which is, kind of similar to, the stoplight idea, right? It's green, yellow, red. And we ended up going with more tiers. And, there's no good research that we've been able to find that really looks at what are the appropriate number of tiers. There's no definitive research on it. But I think, how you get people's attention to let them know that it's particularly a particularly dangerous situation. I think that's why, for example, the Reno Weather Forecast Office did do a statistical analysis, and they pulled out, their 99th percentile events, where the criteria was, the actual conditions on the ground were in that 99th percentile, I believe. And they kind of optimized for what they call a particularly dangerous red flag warning. And I think that does get people's attention. They issue those very, very infrequently, but when they do, it can lead to de-energizing the electrical grid, for example. Parts of like the 395 corridor, I know were de-energized a few years ago due to one of those, in an effort to prevent those new starts. And of course, we've seen in California that, power lines running through these highly flammable areas are often very problematic. And really the only safe course is to de-energize, but that brings its own set of, challenge issues.
For sure.
But, how you get people's attention is really tough, particularly if you have areas like Paradise or Northern California where big chunks of that landscape, don't have good cell phone coverage. It's very remote. People are kind of tucked away. It can be often very challenging and often have, its own set of issues with trying to notify people, and trying to notify them rapidly is really, really difficult. Because so it's really that preemptive period. I think we saw, it would have been, I'm thinking of the Tubbs fire, that was weather driven, but it was set up climatically, from actually about a month or 2 previously. A really hot period of time had dried the fuels, and then a month and a half later, we had the weather event that really all the cheese holes lined up, and it was really explosive growth. So taking all of those factors into account and letting people know that this is an exceptionally dangerous situation, I think is really important.
Yeah, and that's our bread and butter, is communicating that threat. So certainly, I can imagine a lot of research potential, research to operations potential over the coming years in the fire weather community forecast, forecast and just communications community. All right, so here's a question from Mark. Are there any best practices that the Australian meteorologists use that would benefit the National Weather Service? And just a follow-up, how long did it take you to assimilate into their operations, say from a DSS perspective, decision support service perspective?
Okay, I'll hit the second question first. We arrived the first day. We basically got a little overview of what they do. We were sent out. The other forecasts and I from the U.S. were Patrick Gilchrist from Montana. We were sent out over to the EOC to get a feel for what's going on over there. That's where the emergency managers were, the fire behavior analysts, and so that was kind of unique to see that. And then got back that afternoon, got a little bit more familiar with the terrain and topography, and the next day was trained, and by day 2 I was starting to do my own spot forecast. And of course I had a lot of help, but basically from day 3 on I was on my own. But so we had to spin up fast, get a good feel for the lay of the land. Of course there was always other forecasters there that I could question, how does this work in this particular situation? So it wasn't like I was operating by myself, but the load of spot forecasts that I was starting to pick up, I was doing 10 to 12, eventually up to 16 spot forecasts, each taking about 20 to 30 minutes long because they're quite variable in terrain and in the weather as itself. So I spun up very fast, and so they were delighted in the fact that I was able to get myself in that kind of situation. And that's what all the IMETs in the United States have to do, because we don't go just to fires in our own county warning area. We can go to Alaska, in Montana could come down to New Mexico, I could go to California, Nebraska. So you need to be able to adapt and spin up as fast as possible. Thank goodness for Google Earth. You can get some idea of what the terrain is, but being there in person really helps out a lot. As far as any best practices, I think they might have learned more from us, the Australians learned more from what our practices are than I actually picked up from them. And I can't really say I picked up anything very new from them, probably some subtle things, but off the top of my head, I can't think of them right now.
I think it's just a very collaborative process. It's been great working with the Australians in fire weather and just, their Bureau of Meteorology in general, just learning back and forth about how to forecast better. So I applaud your willingness to go down there and help them out and, give some of them a break, and then also, yeah, teach them a few new things on what we do up here and how it could really benefit their operations. Let's see. So here's another one for you, Tamara and Sarah. Do you have any ideas to address risk assessment when the situation has become climatologically favorable for fires? So maybe it's sort of similar to the question I had asked you before, but looking from a climatological perspective.
Is it for a tool or a way to do that? I guess I'm looking for just a wee bit more.
Okay. It doesn't specify whether a tool or just communicating in general, but just for the public, do you have any ideas to, I guess, communicate the potential risk if climatologically conditions are favorable? Does that help?
I mean, Sarah, jump in, but I think you need both the climate and the weather, right? Because you have to have that start, and that's why the red flag watches and warnings program is often so challenging, is that you can have perfect conditions, but if you don't have that fire start, then you don't have the event. And so we've talked over and over again about, what is the best analog. It's, tornadoes, I think, is the closest we come up with, on that. Hurricanes, well, we can see those, like, we track those, but, is it going to, happen or not happen? And so I think we do have some new tools coming online. The Evaporative Demand Drought Index has shown some real value in basically identifying snow drought, and also some value in having a specific wildfire component. It's known as EDDI. I'm sure many people on the call are familiar with EDDI, but we worked with Predictive Services out of Reading, North Ops, to develop a wildfire component for EDDI, which is shown some nice forecasting abilities around looking 2 to 3 weeks out in terms of predicting where fuels might be. I think I have that right. Dan McElvoy is the lead researcher on that project for us, and that was funded by NIDIS, which is part of NOAA. But communicating that in combination, I think it's just, really, finding the right language and, the right way to broadcast that. And maybe this means working with the broadcast community more closely about, when that potential for, difficult to control explosive fire growth with rapid spread is likely to happen, and then giving people, things that they can do proactively and really kind of in training people living in those high risk areas, what those are. I mean, they might even be really simple things, like make sure your phone is charged, roll up the windows in the car sitting outside, have a brief discussion with people before you leave for that day that, may need extra time or additional help to evacuate, or if you have, large, livestock that may be time consuming. I mean, I think that we have all the knowledge. It's just packaging it in the right way in a way that's geographically relevant for that population, but also having some guidance on a national level about, when those warnings should be issued.
Yeah, it's excellent. I appreciate all of the questions coming in from the audience. They've been tough, and I like it. We have one more question. I know we're already over the top of the hour, but we have one more question we'll ask to the group, and then it's kind of a toughie again, and then we'll close up. So, do you feel like the NFDRS 2016 and the Canadian system in a gridded form versus historical point-based form might still be useful to represent the fuel component for our red flag warning decisions? If you need me to repeat that, I can.
I think one of the challenges we've already come upon in this project is that it's my impression from the people that we're working with that integrating gridded data is not necessarily where we're at yet. So that's, I mean, we're a little ways back. We're still trying to determine who our primary audience for the warning is. And I think once we get that figured out, some more information will come forth on how to package messaging. But the gridded data has been a little bit of a struggle so far.
Yeah, we're just to operationalize that is just for the National Weather Service is just really we're not there. And that's the message that the basically the advisory group that we have working on our project. We just had a really long and robust and lively conversation about that very topic for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Our last call, and we have another call scheduled today, so we'll be like, hey, which one of you popped that question into there?
I can tell you if you want.
I know. I
know who
have some guesses, I think. But I think that's the direction everybody wants to go. I just think it's going to be, a number of years before that can be operationalized. What Matt Jolly can do in his lab in Missoula is absolutely phenomenal. He cannot support the entire National Weather Service. So we're going there. I really believe that what it sounds like to me is that is the direction everybody wants to go, but there's some certain realities about scaling that up that we're not quite there yet. So.
All right. Well, Ben, Mark, Tamara, and Sarah, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share to our audience on anything fire weather?
Let's all hope the fire season is low key this year.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I will say thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to our speakers for presenting just an incredible wealth of information on on fire weather forecasting, unique experiences across the board, and communication. How do we communicate the fire threat, I should say, better to our communities and our customers? I also want to give a huge shout out to our social media committee member, Hannah Strong, for being our live tweeter today. We appreciate all the work you do. And that's pretty much all we have for this month's webinar. Please join us next month as we will have Dr. Neil Jacobs join us. He will be talking about the EPIC program, which is the Earth Prediction Innovation Center. And he will be joining us on April 29th at 1 p.m. Central Time. So mark your calendars for that. It should be an excellent talk as we look towards the future of weather modeling and such. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you next month. Take care and stay healthy, all right? I tell you, stay healthy. Thank you.